Welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe for the best Reddit creepypasta stories, perfect for bedtime chills. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a comment. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the story. Hey everyone, throwaway account here, because I don't want this tied back to me. I found a ritual where you can summon dead spirits by name, and I tried to summon myself. I was alive at the time, now I'm stuck in between life and death. So, a bit of background first. I'm not some weirdo who messes around with the occult for fun. I work a mundane job, live in a tiny apartment, and my social life is pretty much non-existent. I guess you could say I was bored and a bit desperate for something more. Anyway, I stumbled across this old book in a second-hand store. The cover was this dark, weathered leather with strange symbols etched into it. I didn't think much of it at the time, just thought it looked cool. Fast forward to a few nights ago. It was a Friday, and instead of hitting up bars or hanging with friends, I was alone in my apartment, flipping through this creepy book. Most of it was nonsense, or so I thought, until I came across a section on summoning spirits. There were detailed instructions, weird incantations, and a list of ingredients. One line caught my eye: summon the spirit of the living for a glimpse into the void. I know, it sounds stupid now, but I was intrigued. I mean, summoning my own spirit while still alive? It felt like the ultimate form of navel-gazing, a way to look into the deepest part of my own soul. Or maybe I was just looking for a way to spice up my monotonous life. Either way, I decided to give it a go. The ritual required a few specific items. A candle made of human fat. No, I didn't kill anyone. I found one on some shady corner of the internet. A mirror that had never reflected sunlight, and my own blood. The blood part was easy. I pricked my finger and let a few drops fall onto the mirror. With the candle lit and placed in front of the mirror, I began chanting the incantation from the book. At first, nothing happened. I felt like an idiot, sitting in the dark with a bleeding finger, chanting nonsense. But then, the air around me grew colder. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the candle's flame flickered wildly before steadying into a tall, thin line of fire. The room went eerily silent, like all sound had been sucked out. I looked into the mirror, and that's when I saw it. My reflection was wrong. It was me, but not me. The eyes were hollow, like two dark pits leading into nothingness. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was this faint, malevolent smile playing on its lips. I tried to move, but my body felt paralyzed, stuck in place. The reflection began to speak, but its voice wasn't coming from the mirror. It was in my head, a low, guttural whisper that made my skin crawl. "Welcome," it said. "You have summoned yourself, but not as you know. You are now between life and death, a visitor in the void." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body remained frozen, my mind trapped in a state of sheer terror. The reflection started to move on its own, stepping out of the mirror. It stood in front of me, mirroring my appearance, but twisted, wrong. The smile grew wider, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It reached out, its fingers cold and clammy, touching my face. I felt a searing pain as if my skin was being peeled away. Then everything went black. I woke up on the floor, the candle extinguished, the room back to its normal temperature. But something was different. I felt off. I dragged myself to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. My reflection was normal, but I didn't feel like myself. It was like a part of me had been ripped away and replaced with something else. Since that night, I've been experiencing the most horrifying things. I see shadows moving in the corners of my vision, hear whispers when I'm alone, and sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see that twisted version of myself grinning back. My dreams are plagued with nightmarish visions of a dark, endless void where I'm constantly falling, surrounded by faceless figures whispering my name. The worst part is the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, waiting. I've tried to go about my daily life, but it's getting harder to act normal when I feel like I'm constantly on the brink of madness. I don't know what I summoned or what it did to me, but I'm terrified that I've opened a door I can't close, that I'm no longer truly alive or dead, but stuck somewhere in between. I need help. Has anyone else experienced anything like this? Is there a way to reverse the ritual? Please, if you know anything, tell me. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. After that first night, I tried to ignore what I experienced. I went to work, tried to focus on my tasks, but it was impossible. I kept seeing things that weren't there. Co-workers' faces would sometimes distort into grotesque, twisted versions of themselves. One time, my boss's eyes turned completely black during a meeting, and I swear I saw maggots crawling out of his mouth. I had to excuse myself, ran to the bathroom, and puked my guts out. It didn't stop there. At night, I could hear scratching noises from behind the walls of my apartment. They'd start faintly, then grow louder, like something was trying to claw its way out. My sleep was plagued with vivid nightmares. I saw myself standing at the edge of a dark abyss, those faceless figures whispering, their voices like nails on a chalkboard, dragging me closer to the edge. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. The worst was when I started losing time. I'd zone out, and when I'd come to, hours would have passed without me realizing it. One time, I woke up, standing in the middle of my living room, covered in blood. I panicked, thinking I'd hurt myself, but I couldn't find any wounds. The blood wasn't mine. Desperate for answers, I decided to go back to the second-hand store where I found the book. Maybe the owner knew something about it. When I got there, the place was gone. It was just an empty, abandoned storefront. I asked around, but no one seemed to remember the store ever being there. It was like it had vanished into thin air. With nowhere else to turn, I started researching online. Most of what I found was useless, but I did come across a forum for people who claimed to have had similar experiences. They talked about a phenomenon called shadowing, where the ritual causes a part of your soul to split and exist in a parallel dimension. It sounded like bullshit, but it was the closest thing to an explanation I had. One user, in particular, caught my attention. They went by the name Void Seeker and seemed to know a lot about this stuff. I messaged them, explained what happened, and they responded almost immediately. They told me I had to perform a counter-ritual to seal the rift I had opened and reunite my fractured soul. The instructions were complex and disturbing, involving a mix of old symbols, chanting, and again, my own blood. That night, I gathered the necessary items: a rusty knife, a bowl, and some black candles. I drew the symbols on my apartment floor, lit the candles, and started the incantation. Halfway through, the temperature dropped, and the candle's flames turned blue. I could feel something, a presence growing stronger. Then, I heard a voice behind me, the same guttural whisper from the mirror. "You cannot undo what is done," it said. "You are mine now." I spun around, and there it was, my twisted reflection, standing in the middle of my living room. It was more solid now, more real. Its hollow eyes bored into me, and its smile widened, revealing those jagged teeth. I tried to continue the ritual, but my voice caught in my throat. The creature lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. Its cold, clammy hands wrapped around my throat, and I felt my life slipping away. Just as I was about to pass out, it stopped and leaned in close. "This is only the beginning," it whispered, before disappearing into thin air. I lay on the floor, gasping for breath, the candles extinguished, and the room back to normal. Since then, the hauntings have escalated. I see the twisted version of myself more often, sometimes in the mirror, sometimes in the shadows of my apartment. It's like it's always watching, waiting. My sense of reality is slipping. I'm afraid to sleep, afraid to be alone, but there's no one I can turn to. My family would think I'm insane, and my friends, well, I don't really have any friends. I need to find a way to end this, to close the rift and get my life back. But every time I try, that thing gets stronger. I don't know how much longer I can keep fighting it. If anyone out there knows anything, please, I need your help. I'm scared, more scared than I've ever been in my life. After the last incident, I was desperate. I barely slept, barely ate, just trying to figure out a way to end this nightmare. I spent hours scouring the internet, reaching out to every contact I had, even those from years ago. Most people thought I was joking or just plain crazy. But then I got a reply from someone unexpected. An old college friend, Mark, who I hadn't spoken to in years, reached out. He told me he'd been involved in some occult stuff in the past and might have an idea of how to help. I was skeptical, but desperate enough to try anything. We agreed to meet at his place the next evening. When I got there, Mark's apartment was dark, cluttered with strange artifacts and books piled high. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. We didn't waste time on small talk. I told him everything, and he listened intently, nodding occasionally. "I've heard of this before," he said finally, lighting a cigarette with a trembling hand. "The shadow ritual is powerful and dangerous. You're dealing with something that feeds on fear and chaos. You summoned a part of yourself, but it's more like a parasite now, feeding off your life force." He explained that the only way to get rid of it was to confront it directly in the void. The void, according to Mark, was a place between worlds, where these entities thrived. To get there, I had to perform another ritual, this one even more dangerous. It required a binding circle, candles, and a piece of my soul, which he claimed I could transfer into a vessel. He handed me a small obsidian knife and an ancient-looking jar. We set everything up in his living room. The atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with tension and the smell of burnt sage. Mark drew the binding circle with chalk, muttering incantations under his breath. I cut my palm with the knife, letting the blood drip into the jar. The pain was sharp, but I barely noticed it over the adrenaline pumping through my veins. As I chanted the incantation, the room grew colder. The shadows lengthened, and I felt a familiar presence creeping in. My twisted reflection appeared in the circle, grinning maniacally. The candle's flames flickered violently, casting eerie dancing shadows on the walls. "You cannot escape me," it hissed. "You are mine." Ignoring its taunts, I continued the ritual. Mark was right beside me, guiding me through the steps. The entity inside the circle began thrashing, its form shifting and distorting. It was trying to break free, but the binding circle held it in place. Just when I thought we were making progress, the entity let out an ear-piercing scream. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, like nails on a chalkboard mixed with the howling of a tortured soul. The room shook, and the circle started to crack. Mark shouted for me to finish the incantation, but the words got stuck in my throat. I could feel my strength fading, the life being drained out of me. The entity lunged at me, its cold, clammy hands reaching for my throat. I dropped the jar, and it shattered on the floor. My blood pooled around it, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest. It was like my heart was being squeezed. The life force ripped out of me. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Mark tried to help, but the entity turned on him, slashing his arm with its sharp, claw-like fingers. He fell back, clutching his wound, and I saw the fear in his eyes. The entity was out of control, feeding on our fear and pain. With my last bit of strength, I grabbed the obsidian knife and plunged it into the entity's chest. It let out another scream, this one more of rage than pain, and its form started to dissolve. The room filled with a blinding light, and I felt a force pulling me into the void. The next thing I knew, I was standing in a vast, dark expanse. The void was cold, empty, and silent. I could see the entity, now a shadowy figure, lurking in the distance. It was weakened, but still dangerous. I knew this was my chance to end it once and for all. I faced the entity, gripping the knife tightly. It charged at me, and I met it head-on. The battle was brutal, a clash of wills and strength. Every time it attacked, I countered, striking back with all my might. The void echoed with the sounds of our struggle, a haunting symphony of despair. Finally, I managed to drive the knife deep into the entity's heart. It let out a final, agonizing scream before disintegrating into nothingness. The void started to collapse, and I felt myself being pulled back into reality. I woke up on Mark's living room floor, covered in blood and sweat. Mark was beside me, his arm bandaged, but otherwise okay. We had done it. The entity was gone, and the rift was closed, but I didn't feel like myself. I was exhausted, drained, and still haunted by the horrors I'd witnessed. Mark helped me clean up and made me promise to stay in touch. He warned me that the effects of the ritual might linger, and I should be cautious. I thanked him and left, feeling a mix of relief and dread. It's been a few days since then, and I'm still struggling. The shadows are gone, but the fear remains. I keep seeing flashes of the void, the faceless figures, and that twisted version of myself. I don't know if I'll ever be the same, but at least I'm alive, for now. If you're reading this, please, take my advice. Stay away from the occult. It's not worth the risk. I barely made it out alive, and I'm not sure I'll ever fully recover. But at least I have a chance, and that's more than I can say for most. After the battle in the void and the entity's destruction, I tried to go back to my normal life. I went to work, hung out with Mark a few times, and even managed to get a decent amount of sleep. For a while, it seemed like everything was finally settling down. But then, the nightmares started again. They were different this time, more vivid, more real. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. In these dreams, I wasn't in the void. I was back in my apartment, but it was wrong. The walls were covered in what looked like black mold, oozing and pulsing like it was alive. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with a sickly, sweet smell that made me gag. In one of the nightmares, I saw myself standing in the corner of my bedroom, but it wasn't me. It was that twisted reflection, grinning with those jagged teeth, its hollow eyes staring right through me. It whispered my name over and over, getting louder each time until it was screaming. I'd wake up just before it reached me, my throat raw from my own screams. During the day, I started noticing strange things around my apartment. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker, and I'd hear faint whispers coming from the walls. It felt like I was being watched, followed, even in my own home. The presence I thought I'd gotten rid of was back, and it was stronger. One night, I came home to find my apartment in shambles. Furniture was overturned, pictures were smashed, and the walls were covered in deep, claw-like scratches. It looked like a wild animal had torn the place apart. I called Mark in a panic, and he rushed over. When he saw the state of my apartment, his face went pale. "We didn't finish it," he said, his voice trembling. "The entity, it must have found a way back." We quickly realized that the binding circle we had used was flawed. It hadn't fully contained the entity, and now it was back with a vengeance. Mark suggested we perform another ritual, this time with more powerful protections. I was reluctant, but I knew we had no other choice. We spent the next few days gathering supplies, studying the book, and preparing for the ritual. This time, we needed more than just blood and candles. We needed something personal, something that held a part of my soul. Mark suggested using a piece of clothing I wore during the first ritual, so I dug out the shirt I had worn that night. The ritual was set for midnight. We drew the binding circle with precision, double-checked the symbols, and lit the candles. As we began chanting, the temperature dropped, and the air grew heavy. I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger, lurking just beyond the circle. This time, we were ready. Mark had reinforced the circle with salt and iron filings, and we both wore protective amulets. The entity appeared, its form more solid than before, but it couldn't break through the circle. It howled in rage, its hollow eyes burning with hatred. "You cannot escape me," it snarled. "You belong to the void." Ignoring its taunts, we continued the incantation. The entity thrashed against the circle, its form flickering and distorting. I could feel it trying to pull me into the void, but the circle held strong. The air was filled with a high-pitched wail, the sound of the entity's rage and desperation. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the candles, their flames flickering wildly. The entity's form grew larger, more menacing, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned, and there it was, my twisted reflection, grinning with malice. "You're mine," it whispered, its voice echoing in my head. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like my heart was being squeezed. The room spun, and I fell to my knees. Mark's voice seemed distant, drowned out by the entity's laughter. I could feel my life force being drained, the darkness closing in. But then, I remembered the jar, the piece of my soul I had transferred into it. With my last bit of strength, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the shard of the broken jar. I pressed it against the entity's form, and it let out a deafening scream. The entity's form began to dissolve, its screams fading into a low, guttural moan. The pressure on my chest lifted, and I gasped for breath. The lights flickered back on, and the room was silent. The entity was gone, its presence erased from my apartment. Mark helped me to my feet, and we stood in stunned silence. We had done it. The entity was truly gone this time, but the victory felt hollow. I was exhausted, drained, and haunted by the memories of the void. I knew I would never be the same. Mark stayed with me that night, just in case. We cleaned up the apartment, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy, but the shadows still lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The nightmares continued, and I started to wonder if I would ever be free of the void's grasp. If you're reading this, please learn from my mistakes. The occult is not something to be taken lightly. The entities you summon are powerful, dangerous, and they will stop at nothing to consume you. I've survived, but I'm forever changed. I can only hope that one day the nightmares will end and I can find peace. Until then, I will remain vigilant, watching for the shadows that lurk in the corners of my mind. After the second ritual, I thought things would get better, but I was wrong. The nightmares continued, more vivid and terrifying than ever. Each night, I found myself back in the void, surrounded by faceless figures whispering my name. The twisted version of myself was always there, watching, waiting. During the day, I started losing time again. Hours would vanish, and I'd find myself in strange places with no memory of how I got there. One time, I woke up, standing on the edge of a bridge, looking down at the icy water below. Another time, I found myself in a dark alley, my hands covered in dirt and my clothes torn. I was terrified of what I might do next, afraid that the entity was still controlling me. Mark tried to help, but even he was starting to get scared. He suggested I see a priest, thinking maybe a blessing or an exorcism might help. I was willing to try anything at this point, so we made an appointment with Father Thomas, a priest known for dealing with paranormal issues. When we arrived at the church, Father Thomas greeted us with a solemn look. He listened to my story without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer by the minute. After I finished, he took a deep breath and crossed himself. "You are dealing with a powerful and malevolent spirit," he said. "The void is a place of great darkness, and those who venture there rarely return whole. I will do what I can to help you, but you must be prepared for the worst." We followed him to a small room at the back of the church. It was dimly lit, filled with religious artifacts and the faint scent of incense. Father Thomas began to pray, sprinkling holy water around the room. The air grew heavy, and I felt a familiar chill creeping in. As Father Thomas continued his prayers, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, shifting and writhing. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath forming in front of me. Suddenly, the candles flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see the twisted version of myself standing there, its hollow eyes glowing with malevolent light. It leaned in close, its breath cold against my skin. "You cannot escape," it whispered. "You are mine." Father Thomas began chanting louder, his voice shaking but determined. The entity snarled and lunged at him, but was stopped by an invisible barrier. The room shook, and I felt a pressure building in my chest, like my heart was being squeezed. The entity screamed, a sound of pure rage and pain, and its form began to flicker and distort. I could feel it pulling at me, trying to drag me back into the void. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head, the pain unbearable. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, The room was filled with a blinding light. The entity let out one final agonizing scream and disappeared, leaving behind an eerie silence. The pressure in my chest lifted, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Father Thomas helped me up, his face pale but relieved. "It's over," he said. "The entity is gone." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The void had left its mark on me, and I could still feel its presence lurking in the back of my mind. The nightmares continued, and I still lost time, but the twisted version of myself no longer appeared. It was a small relief, but a relief nonetheless. Mark stayed with me for a few days, just to make sure I was okay. We tried to go back to our normal lives, but the experience had changed us both. I felt like a shadow of my former self, constantly on edge, waiting for the next attack. One night, I woke up to find myself standing in front of the mirror in my bathroom. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. My reflection stared back at me, but something was different. The eyes were mine, but there was a darkness in them, a void that threatened to consume me. I reached out to touch the mirror, and my reflection's hand met mine. A cold, clammy sensation spread through my body, and I felt a familiar presence creeping in. The twisted smile appeared on my reflection's face, and I knew the entity was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The void is calling, and I can feel myself slipping away. If you're reading this, please, stay away from the occult. The darkness is real, and once it has you, it never lets go. This is my final warning. The void is always watching, always waiting. Be careful what you wish for, because you might just get it. Goodbye. Alright, so I know this is going to sound crazy, but please hear me out. I've never been the superstitious type. I mean, yeah, I'd watch horror movies and get a kick out of urban legends, but I never took that stuff seriously. That was until I made the stupidest mistake of my life. It started a few months back when my grandma passed away. She was a sweet old lady, always telling me these wild stories about the supernatural. She had this one story about a cursed piece of wood she kept locked in her attic. She said it was from some ancient tree that had been used for all kinds of dark rituals back in the day. I always thought it was just another one of her spooky tales to keep me entertained. After she died, I was in charge of cleaning out her house. While going through her things, I found a box in the attic. Inside was a piece of wood, exactly as she had described, along with a small urn. On a whim, I decided to take them home. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, that was the first domino in this messed up chain of events. I was having a rough time dealing with her death. I missed her stories and the comfort she brought into my life. One night, in a particularly dark mood, I decided to combine her ashes with the wood to make a Ouija board. Yeah, I know how it sounds, but I thought maybe, just maybe, I could contact her one last time. I carved the board myself, inscribing the letters and numbers with a knife my grandma had left me. It took me hours, but by the end of it, I had something that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. I even made a planchette from the leftover wood. I sat there, staring at this makeshift board, feeling a mix of anticipation and dread. The first night I used it, nothing happened. I felt kind of stupid, sitting alone in my room, asking questions to thin air. I was about to pack it all away when I felt this sudden, intense cold. My breath fogged in the air, and I got chills down my spine. That's when the planchette started to move. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe my shaky hands. But then, it spelled out, Hello. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I asked, "Grandma, is that you?" The planchette moved again, this time spelling YES. I don't know if it was the grief or the sheer weirdness of the situation, but I started crying. I told her how much I missed her, and for a while, it was just this one-sided conversation with me pouring my heart out. Then, things took a dark turn. I asked her if she was at peace. The planchette didn't move for a long time. When it finally did, it spelled N-O. I asked why, and the answer I got was chilling. H-E-L-L. I couldn't believe it. My sweet grandma in hell. It didn't make any sense. I asked who put her there, and the answer came. H-I-M. I was terrified, but I couldn't stop myself. I asked who him was, and the reply was D-E-M-O-N. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. My room felt like it was closing in on me, and the air grew thicker. I decided I had to stop. I said goodbye and closed the session, but as I moved to put the board away, I noticed something horrifying. The planchette was smeared with what looked like blood. I checked my hands, but there were no cuts or wounds. The blood was coming from the board itself, seeping out of the carved letters. I freaked out, threw the board into a closet, and tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But that night, the nightmares began. I dreamt of my grandma, her face twisted in agony, reaching out to me from a sea of flames. I could hear her screams, begging for help. Each time I tried to reach her, something would pull her back into the fire. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I decided to get rid of the board, but when I opened the closet, it wasn't there. Instead, I found it back on my desk, the bloodstains even more pronounced. I felt sick to my stomach. I had to get rid of it, but every time I tried, it would somehow find its way back. I threw it in the trash, burned it, even buried it, but nothing worked. It always came back, and with it, the nightmares grew worse. I started seeing things during the day too, shadows moving in the corner of my eye, whispers that I couldn't quite catch. My friends noticed I wasn't myself, but how could I explain what was happening without sounding insane? One night, things escalated to a new level of horror. I woke up to find the board on my bed, and the planchette was moving on its own. It spelled out H-E-L-P. Then my bedroom door slammed shut, and the lights flickered out. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the glowing letters on the board. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming towards me. I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. The footsteps stopped right by my bed, and I felt a cold, bony hand on my shoulder. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then, a voice whispered in my ear. A voice that wasn't my grandma's. It was deep, guttural, and filled with malice. It said, "You should have never called me." I don't know how I managed to survive that night. Somehow, I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. But the terror didn't end there. I was marked now, a target for whatever malevolent force I had unleashed. I've tried everything to rid myself of this curse. Priests, shamans, you name it. Nothing works. The nightmares, the whispers, the shadows, they're all part of my daily life now. I can't escape it. I'm writing this as a warning. Don't mess with things you don't understand. I thought it was just a harmless experiment, a way to connect with my grandma. But I was wrong. So very wrong. If you ever come across something that feels off, something that gives you that gut-wrenching sense of dread, trust your instincts. Don't be like me. Don't let curiosity drag you into the depths of hell. I wish I could say things got better after that night, but they didn't. If anything, they got worse. A lot worse. The days turned into a blur of paranoia and fear. I barely slept, and when I did, the nightmares were relentless, each one more vivid and horrifying than the last. But the worst part was the waking hours when I started to doubt my own sanity. One afternoon, a few weeks after the first incident, I decided to visit my friend Mark. Mark and I have been buddies since high school. If anyone could help me sort this out, it was him. He was into all that supernatural stuff, always talking about ghosts, demons, and other creepy shit. I figured if anyone had a solution, it would be him. When I got to his place, I was a mess. He took one look at me and knew something was seriously wrong. "Jesus, man, you look like you haven't slept in weeks," he said, pulling me inside. I spilled everything, the Ouija board, the messages, the blood, the nightmares. Mark listened, his face growing more serious by the second. When I finished, he sat back, deep in thought. "We need to see it," he said finally. "The board, I mean." I was reluctant, but I knew he was right. We drove back to my place in silence, the air thick with tension. When we got there, the board was waiting for us on the coffee table. I hadn't put it there. I hadn't even touched it since the night it appeared on my bed. Mark stared at it, his expression unreadable. This is bad," he muttered. "Really bad." He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the board. He said he needed to show them to a friend of his, someone who knew more about this kind of stuff. I didn't argue. I just wanted it gone. That night, I stayed at Mark's place. I couldn't bear to be alone in that apartment anymore. We drank beers and watched TV, trying to act like everything was normal, but the unease was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Around midnight, Mark's phone buzzed. It was a message from his friend, a guy named Jake who claimed to be an expert in the occult. Mark read it aloud. "The wood, the ashes, they've created a conduit, a portal. Whatever you've been talking to, it's not your grandma, it's something else, something evil." I felt a chill run down my spine. A portal. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This was all too much, but Mark's face told me he believed it. And honestly, at that point, I was desperate enough to believe anything. Jake's message continued. "You need to destroy the board and close the portal. Salt, fire, and a prayer of protection. Do it now." We gathered the supplies and headed back to my apartment. I felt like I was walking to my execution. The place was dark, the air thick and suffocating. We found the board right where we left it, sitting innocently on the coffee table. Mark sprinkled salt around the board in a wide circle while I recited the prayer Jake had sent. My voice shook, but I kept going, desperate for this to end. Then, Mark doused the board in lighter fluid and set it on fire. For a moment, nothing happened. The flames crackled and roared, but the board remained intact. Then, with a loud crack, it split down the middle, a plume of black smoke rising from it. The smell was awful, like burning flesh and sulfur. I gagged, stepping back. The fire burned for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. When it finally died down, there was nothing left but ashes. I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was over. But that night, the nightmares were worse than ever. I dreamt of a dark figure, its face hidden in shadow, standing at the foot of my bed. It whispered in a language I couldn't understand, but the malice in its voice was clear. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. Mark was already awake, his face pale and drawn. "I had the same dream," he said. "The same fucking dream." We didn't sleep after that. Instead, we sat in silence, the reality of our situation sinking in. We had opened a door to something we couldn't control, and now it was here, in our world. The next few days were a blur. Mark and I tried to find more information, scouring the internet and old books, but nothing seemed to help. The shadows in my apartment grew darker, the whispers louder. I started seeing the dark figure everywhere, in mirrors, in reflections, even in the corner of my eye. Always watching, always waiting. One night, Mark suggested we perform an exorcism. He had found a ritual online, something that promised to cleanse and banish evil spirits. I was skeptical, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. We gathered the necessary items: candles, holy water, a crucifix. Mark led the ritual, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. As he recited the incantations, I felt a sudden, intense pressure in the room. The air grew cold, and the lights flickered. Then, the dark figure appeared. It stood in the center of the salt circle, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Mark's voice faltered, but he kept going. The figure laughed, a deep, echoing sound that sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, the candles blew out, plunging us into darkness. I heard Mark scream, and then something hit me, hard. I fell to the floor, pain exploding in my head. The last thing I saw before blacking out was the dark figure looming over me, its eyes burning with malevolent glee. When I came to, Mark was gone. The apartment was trashed, the salt circle scattered, the holy water spilled. I called his name, but there was no answer. Panic set in. I called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I called the police, but what could I tell them? That my friend had been taken by a demon? I was alone, truly alone, and the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I had opened the door. I had invited this evil into my life, and now it wasn't just after me. It was after everyone I cared about. I spent the next few days in a daze, too afraid to sleep, too exhausted to stay awake. I kept my eyes open for any sign of Mark, but there was nothing, just the darkness closing in on me. I don't know what to do anymore. Every attempt to rid myself of this curse has failed. The nightmares, the whispers, the dark figure, they're all part of my daily life now. I'm trapped in a waking nightmare, and there's no escape. If anyone reading this knows what to do, please help. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. And if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, remember this. Some doors are better left unopened. Curiosity can lead to the darkest corners of hell. And once you're there, there's no way out. After Mark disappeared, things got even more unbearable. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched every second of every day. It felt like my apartment was alive, pulsating, with an evil energy that grew stronger with each passing moment. I was desperate, grasping at straws for any solution, any way out of this nightmare. I hadn't seen my family in months. I was too scared to involve them, fearing that whatever curse I had unleashed would latch onto them too. But I couldn't stay away forever. My mum called, worried sick about my absence. She demanded I come over for dinner. Reluctantly, I agreed, deciding maybe a change of scenery would help. Driving to my parents' house felt surreal. I hadn't been there since before Grandma passed away. The familiarity of the place was comforting, but there was a nagging sense of dread in the back of my mind. I tried to push it down, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Dinner was awkward. My mum kept asking if I was okay, and my dad shot me concerned looks over his glasses. I couldn't tell them the truth, so I mumbled something about work being stressful. But halfway through the meal, the air in the room grew cold, and I knew it had followed me. My mum noticed first. She shivered, rubbing her arms and glancing around the room. "Is it just me, or did it get really cold in here?" she asked. Before I could respond, the lights flickered. My dad frowned, setting down his fork. "Must be a power surge," he muttered. I knew better. I felt the familiar creeping presence. My heart pounded, and I stood up abruptly. "I think I should go," I said, my voice shaking. My mum looked hurt. "But you just got here, honey." "I'm sorry, Mum. I'll call you later," I promised, practically running out the door. As I drove back to my apartment, I saw it. The dark figure standing by the side of the road, its eyes glowing that sickly yellow. I nearly swerved off the road, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled fear. When I looked back, it was gone. Back in my apartment, the atmosphere was even worse. The shadows seemed to crawl across the walls, and the whispers were louder. I felt like I was losing my mind. I had to do something, anything to end this. That night, I went back to the internet, searching forums and obscure websites for answers. That's when I stumbled upon a post that gave me a glimmer of hope. It was from a guy named Sam who claimed he had dealt with a similar situation. He mentioned a ritual that could potentially close the portal and banish the entity for good. The ritual was complex and dangerous, involving blood, fire, and invoking ancient protective spirits. I was terrified, but I had no other options. I gathered the materials: candles, a ceremonial knife, herbs, and a bowl. The final step required something personal from the entity's target. In my case, it was my blood. I drew a circle with the herbs and candles, the apartment filled with the acrid smell of burning sage. The air felt thick, almost tangible, as I began to chant the incantations from Sam's post. I felt ridiculous, but desperation pushed me forward. As I chanted, the shadows grew darker, swirling around me like a vortex. I took the knife, hesitating only for a moment before slicing my palm and letting the blood drip into the bowl. The shadows recoiled at the sight of the blood, and the whispers turned into angry hisses. The temperature dropped, my breath fogging in the air. I continued the ritual, my voice growing stronger despite the fear gnawing at my insides. The dark figure appeared again, standing just outside the circle. Its eyes bore into mine, filled with hatred. I held my ground, chanting louder. The figure stepped closer, testing the boundaries of the circle. I could feel its malevolent energy pressing against the barrier. The candles flickered wildly, but the circle held. With a final, desperate chant, I threw the blood-soaked herbs into the flames. The room exploded in light, the shadows screaming and writhing. The dark figure let out an inhuman roar, its form dissolving into the air. For a moment, everything was chaos. Then, silence. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air felt lighter. I collapsed, exhaustion and relief washing over me. Had it worked? Was it finally over? The next few days were eerily calm. No whispers, no shadows, no nightmares. I allowed myself to hope, to believe that maybe I had succeeded. But deep down, a part of me knew it wasn't that simple. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. You can't get rid of me that easily. My eyes snapped open, and there it was. The dark figure, standing at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing with malevolent glee. I screamed, but no sound came out. It lunged at me, its cold, bony hands wrapping around my throat. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. It was just a dream, but it felt so real. Too real. I looked around my room, half expecting to see the figure standing there. But I was alone. Or was I? I don't know what to do anymore. The ritual didn't work. The entity is still here, and it's stronger than ever. I'm running out of options, and I'm terrified of what it wants. Every night, the nightmares get worse. Every day, the shadows grow darker. I'm writing this in a last-ditch effort to find help. If anyone out there has any ideas, any solutions, please, I'm begging you. I can't do this alone. And if you're ever tempted to mess with the supernatural, to dabble in things you don't understand, remember my story. Some doors are better left closed. Once you open them, there's no turning back. And the things that come through, they're not just stories, they're real, and they're waiting. After the failed ritual, I was a wreck. Every day felt like a struggle to stay sane. I kept seeing the dark figure out of the corner of my eye, just waiting for the moment to strike. The whispers were relentless, filling my mind with a constant, insidious murmur that I couldn't escape. I knew I had to find another way to end this, but I was running out of ideas. One morning, I received an email from someone named Alex. He claimed he had read my posts and had dealt with something similar. He offered to meet up and discuss what he knew. Normally, I would have been skeptical, but at this point, I was desperate. I agreed to meet him at a cafe downtown. Alex turned out to be a middle-aged guy with a haunted look in his eyes. He had a kind of intensity about him that made me uneasy, but I figured anyone who'd been through what I had would probably look the same. We sat down, and he immediately got to the point. "You're dealing with a powerful entity," he said. "It's not just any spirit. This thing feeds on fear and despair. It won't stop until it's completely broken you." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "How do I stop it?" Alex leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's an old ritual, older than any of the ones you've tried. It's dangerous and it requires a sacrifice. Not just any sacrifice, but something deeply personal, something it craves." My stomach churned. I had already bled for this thing, faced it head on and failed. But Alex's words sparked a glimmer of hope. "What kind of sacrifice?" He hesitated, then said, "It wants a piece of your soul. You have to be willing to give up a part of yourself to banish it." The idea was horrifying, but what choice did I have? Alex explained the ritual in detail, warning me repeatedly of the risks. I had to perform it at the place where I first invoked the entity, my grandma's house. I gathered the necessary items, a mirror, a black candle, and a blade. That night I drove to my grandma's house, the place where all of this began. The house was dark and silent, a stark contrast to the warmth it once held. I could almost hear my grandma's voice, telling me stories by the fireplace. I had to remind myself that those days were gone. I set up the ritual in the living room, placing the mirror on the floor with the black candle in front of it. Alex had warned me that once the ritual began, there was no turning back. I took a deep breath, lit the candle, and began to chant the incantation he had taught me. The air grew colder with each word, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist. I could feel the entity's presence, watching, waiting. When I finished the chant, I took the blade and made a small cut on my palm, letting the blood drip onto the mirror. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and a dark, swirling vortex appeared. I could see the entity's eyes, glowing with malevolence, staring back at me. It was time for the sacrifice. I looked into the mirror and spoke the final words of the ritual, offering a piece of my soul in exchange for banishing the entity. The vortex grew, the pull stronger, and I felt a searing pain in my chest. It was as if something was being ripped from inside me. I screamed, but I didn't stop. The entity roared, its form distorting and writhing. The shadows in the room converged on the mirror, drawn into the vortex. The pain was excruciating, but I held on, forcing myself to complete the ritual. Finally, with a final guttural scream, the entity was sucked into the vortex and the mirror shattered. The room was plunged into silence. The oppressive weight that had hung over me for so long lifted, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. It was over. The entity was gone. But at what cost? I felt hollow, like a part of me was missing. The sacrifice had worked, but I knew I would never be the same. I had given up a piece of my soul, and the emptiness it left behind was a constant reminder of the darkness I had faced. I stayed at my grandma's house that night, too exhausted to drive home. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The nightmares were gone, the whispers silenced, but the emptiness remained, a small price to pay for my sanity. I returned to my apartment, hoping to rebuild my life. I reached out to my parents, explaining that I had been dealing with some personal issues. They were relieved to hear from me and didn't press for details. I didn't tell them about the entity or the sacrifice. Some things are better left unsaid. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on. I reconnected with friends, went back to work, and slowly started to piece my life back together. But there was always that nagging feeling, a sense of loss that I couldn't shake. I had faced something unimaginable, and while I had survived, I was forever changed. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint whisper. My heart raced, but when I opened my eyes, there was nothing there. I listened carefully, but the whisper was gone. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was a reminder that some scars never fully heal. I don't know if the entity is truly gone, or if it's just waiting for another opportunity. But for now, I'm free, and I'll take that over the alternative any day. So, to anyone reading this, take my story as a warning. There are forces in this world we don't understand, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for someone foolish enough to invite them in. If you ever find yourself tempted to dabble in the supernatural, remember my story. Curiosity can open doors that should remain closed, and once you step through, there's no turning back. I wish I could say that the entity was gone for good, that my life returned to normal and I lived happily ever after. But reality isn't that neat. The weeks following the ritual were a blur of trying to rebuild my life, always shadowed by the feeling that something was still off. The emptiness from the sacrifice lingered, a constant reminder of what I had done. One night, months after the ritual, I was home alone. I had just gotten off a long day at work and was looking forward to a quiet evening. I poured myself a drink, sank into the couch, and turned on the TV, trying to lose myself in the mindless chatter of sitcoms. But then, the power went out. The apartment plunged into darkness, and my heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my phone, using its flashlight to navigate the room. I checked the fuse box, but everything seemed fine. That's when I heard it, a whisper, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Help me!" My blood ran cold. It sounded like Mark. I hadn't heard from him since that night. Could it be? I followed the voice, trembling, my mind racing with possibilities. The whisper led me to my bedroom, where the darkness felt thicker, almost suffocating. The voice grew louder, more desperate. "Help me, please!" I shone my flashlight around the room, and that's when I saw it. A faint, ghostly figure standing in the corner. It was Mark, but not as I remembered him. His form was transparent, his face twisted in agony. His eyes met mine, filled with a pleading I couldn't ignore. "Mark," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Is that you?" He nodded, his eyes welling with tears. "You have to help me. It's not over. It's still here, still feeding." I felt a wave of despair wash over me. The entity was still out there, still tormenting those it could. And now it had trapped Mark in some sort of purgatory. I had to do something. I couldn't leave him like this. "What do I need to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark pointed to the floor, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small, dark stain spreading from under the bed. It looked like blood. My stomach churned as I realized what it meant. The entity was still anchored to this place, using the remnants of the cursed wood and ashes I had incorporated into the board. I had to find a way to cleanse it, to completely sever its connection to our world. I grabbed my phone and frantically searched for any rituals or methods that might help. My mind was a blur of desperation and fear. Finally, I found something. A ritual of final banishment, more powerful than anything I had tried before. It required a combination of elements: fire, salt, holy water, and a personal sacrifice, something of deep significance. I gathered the materials, my hands shaking. I knew this was my last chance. If this didn't work, I didn't know what would. I placed the elements in a circle around the dark stain, lighting the candle in the center. I sprinkled the salt and holy water, reciting the incantation I had found. The air grew colder, the shadows more oppressive. The dark stain seemed to pulse, as if alive. I took a deep breath and made the final sacrifice. My grandmother's locket, the only piece of her I had left. I placed it in the center of the circle, my heart breaking at the thought of losing it. As I chanted the final words, the room shook. The darkness around the stain writhed and twisted, and a deafening roar filled the air. The stain began to shrink, the oppressive weight lifting. The ghostly figure of Mark grew brighter, more solid. Then, with a final ear-splitting scream, the stain vanished, and the room fell silent. The air felt lighter, the shadows less threatening. I looked at Mark, hoping against hope that this had worked. He smiled, a sad but grateful smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his form growing fainter. "You freed me." Tears streamed down my face as I watched him fade away, a sense of peace replacing the emptiness inside me. I had done it. I had finally banished the entity and freed Mark. The nightmare was over. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in months. I cleaned up the remnants of the ritual, taking a moment to say a final goodbye to my grandmother's locket. It was a small price to pay for the peace I had gained. Life slowly returned to normal. The whispers, the shadows, the nightmares, they were all gone. I started seeing my family again, reconnecting with friends, and rebuilding my life. But I was forever changed by what I had experienced. I learned a valuable lesson. Some doors are better left unopened. The supernatural is not something to be taken lightly, and curiosity can lead to unimaginable horrors. I hope my story serves as a warning to anyone tempted to dabble in the unknown. If you ever come across something that feels off, something that gives you that gut-wrenching sense of dread, trust your instincts. Don't let curiosity drag you into the depths of hell, because once you're there, there's no turning back. Thank you for listening, and stay safe. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I swear every word of this is true. It started a few weeks ago when my friends and I decided to mess around with a Ouija board. I know, it's the kind of thing you see in horror movies and think, who would be stupid enough to actually do that? Well, apparently we were. It was a Friday night, and we were at Sarah's place. Her parents were out of town, so we had the whole house to ourselves. After a few drinks, someone, I think it was Mike, suggested we try the Ouija board. Sarah's older sister had one stashed in her closet from her goth phase in high school. We dug it out, laughing about how spooky it was going to be. There were 5 of us: me, Sarah, Mike, Jess, and Tom. We set the board up on the living room floor, lit some candles for ambience, and gathered around. I remember feeling a bit uneasy, but I didn't want to be the buzzkill. We placed our fingers lightly on the planchette and started asking the usual questions. Is anyone there? What's your name? Give us a sign. At first, nothing happened. We were all getting bored and about to call it quits when the planchette suddenly jerked to life. It slid across the board, spelling out a name: Azazel. We all exchanged nervous glances, but Mike laughed it off, saying one of us must be messing around. Still, there was this tension in the air, like we all knew something wasn't right. We kept asking questions, and the responses got more and more disturbing. The board claimed to be a demon, and it knew things about us, things no one else could possibly know. Jess was the first to bail, saying she didn't want to do this anymore. She moved her hand, and the planchette stopped. But the rest of us, being the idiots we were, decided to keep going. That's when it happened. We asked the demon to prove it was real, and the planchette flew off the board, hitting the wall with a loud thud. The candles flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. I felt something cold and slimy brush against my arm, and then pain. I looked down to see teeth marks, deep and bleeding, on my forearm. I freaked out, yelling at the others to stop, but they were already panicking too. We tried to say goodbye, to close the session properly, but the planchette wouldn't move. We threw the board back in the closet and tried to forget about it, but the damage was already done. Over the next few days, the bite mark on my arm got worse. It wasn't just a bruise or a scratch. It was like my flesh was rotting away. I went to the doctor, but they couldn't explain it. They gave me some antibiotics and sent me home, but nothing helped. The wound kept getting bigger, and a foul, sickly smell started coming from it. Then the nightmares started. Every night, I'd see the demon from the board. It was tall and shadowy, with glowing red eyes and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. It would bite and claw at me, whispering in a language I didn't understand. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling its presence in the room. My friends weren't doing any better. Sarah started seeing things, shadows moving in her peripheral vision, whispers in empty rooms. Mike had a seizure out of nowhere and was hospitalized for a week. Tom and Jess broke up after a series of violent arguments that neither of them could explain. I tried to get rid of the board, but no matter what I did, it always came back. I burned it, buried it, threw it in a river, but it would reappear in my room, looking more charred and twisted each time. I couldn't escape it, and the bite mark kept spreading. My arm looked like something out of a horror movie, the flesh blackened and decayed. I could see bone in places. I knew I needed help, but who could I turn to? No one would believe me. Even my friends were starting to think I was losing it. They didn't have the physical proof that I did. They just thought they were unlucky or stressed out. I started researching demons, possession, anything that might explain what was happening to me. I found stories of people who had played with Ouija boards and ended up dead or worse. The more I read, the more terrified I became. I tried everything, prayers, rituals, even contacting a priest, but nothing worked. The priest came to my house, blessed it, and said some prayers, but as soon as he left, things got worse. The demon wasn't just tormenting me anymore, it was attacking anyone who tried to help. The worst part is, I can feel myself changing. It's not just the physical decay, it's something deeper. I'm losing my mind. I see things that aren't there, hear voices whispering in my ear, feel a constant gnawing hunger that no food can satisfy. I'm scared to sleep, scared to be alone, scared of what I might do. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The decay is spreading, and I can feel it inside me, like the demon is eating me alive from the inside out. I'm terrified of what's happening to me, but more than that, I'm terrified of what I might become. If anyone out there knows how to stop this, please help me. I don't know how much time I have left before I'm completely consumed. Alright, so here we are again. I didn't expect to be writing this, but things have gotten worse, and I need to get it out somehow. The decay isn't just on my arm anymore. It's spreading to my shoulder, creeping up my neck. The smell is unbearable, a mix of rot and something acrid, like burning plastic. The skin around the wound is black and green, oozing pus that's a sickly yellow. I can barely stand to look at it, let alone touch it. A few days after the initial post, I started noticing other changes. I'm not sure how to explain it, but my senses are off. I see shadows flitting around the edges of my vision, but when I turn, there's nothing there. Sometimes I catch glimpses of figures, dark, twisted shapes with eyes that glow red. They're there for just a second, then gone. I hear whispers too, voices that aren't mine, but seem to come from inside my head. They speak in a language I don't understand, but their tone is always menacing, mocking. Sleep has become impossible. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that living room, surrounded by the candles, the Ouija board, and the demon. It's always there, watching me, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. Sometimes it attacks, biting and clawing at my decaying flesh. I wake up with fresh wounds, bloody scratches that match the ones in my nightmares. Desperate, I reached out to my friends again, but they're all dealing with their own horrors. Sarah refuses to talk about it. She's convinced ignoring it will make it go away. Mike, who was discharged from the hospital, won't answer my calls. Jess, who used to be the level-headed one, now cries hysterically about the voices and the eyes. Tom has gone completely off the grid. His apartment is empty and no one knows where he is. A couple of nights ago, I did something I never thought I would do. I went back to the board. I figured if it could summon this thing, maybe it could tell me how to get rid of it. I know, it's insane, but I was out of options. I lit some candles, set the board on the floor, and placed my fingers on the planchette. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold it still. "Azazel," I whispered, "how do I stop this?" The planchette moved immediately, faster than it ever had before. It spelled out words in a language I didn't understand, then switched to English. "You cannot," it said. "You are mine." My heart was pounding, but I kept going. "What do you want?" "Your soul," it replied. "Your flesh, your pain." I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, squeezing hard. I spun around, but no one was there. When I looked back at the board, the planchette was spelling something else. "Leave, now." Terrified, I threw the board back in the closet and ran to my room. That night, the demon was in my dreams again, but this time it wasn't alone. There were others with it, smaller but just as menacing, surrounding me, chanting in that horrible language. I woke up screaming, my body covered in fresh wounds. The decay has spread to my face now. My left cheek is sunken in, the skin peeling away to reveal raw muscle and bone. People stare at me when I go out, which isn't often. I can't bear their horrified looks, their whispered comments. I'm a walking corpse, a freak. The hunger I mentioned before is getting worse. No matter how much I eat, I'm never satisfied. It's like there's a void inside me that can't be filled. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about things, dark things. I'll see a stray cat or dog and imagine what it would be like to tear into its flesh, to feel its blood running down my throat. It's disgusting, but the thoughts are becoming harder to push away. I'm losing control. Last night, I woke up covered in blood that wasn't mine. I found a dead rat in the corner of my room, its body mangled and torn apart. I don't remember killing it, but I know I did. I can't trust myself anymore. I went back to the doctor, hoping they could help me, but they just looked at me like I was insane. They took some blood samples, but I could tell they didn't expect to find anything. They suggested I see a psychiatrist, but what good would that do? I'm not crazy. This is real. I can feel the demon inside me, eating away at my body, my mind, my soul. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The decay is spreading faster now, and I'm scared of what I'll do when it reaches my brain. If anyone out there knows how to stop this, please, I'm begging you, help me. I don't want to become a monster. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I can feel it coming, the darkness closing in, and I'm so scared. It's been a few days since my last update, and things have taken a turn for the worse. I didn't think it could get any more horrifying, but it has. The decay has spread to my chest and back now, the skin splitting open in places, revealing raw, festering flesh underneath. The smell is unbearable, like rotting meat left out in the sun. I can barely breathe without gagging. The pain is constant, a dull, throbbing ache that never goes away. It's like my whole body is on fire. The worst part is the itchiness, an unbearable, maddening itch that I can't scratch away. My fingers come away bloody every time I try, but the relief is fleeting. I've resorted to wearing gloves to keep from tearing myself apart. I'm not the only one suffering though. Sarah called me last night, sobbing uncontrollably. She said she woke up to find her bedroom covered in blood, her own skin covered in deep, jagged cuts she has no memory of making. She's been hearing voices too, whispering her name, telling her to do unspeakable things. I could hear the fear in her voice, the same fear that's been eating away at me. Mike hasn't been seen since he was discharged from the hospital. Jess went to his apartment to check on him, but it was empty. No sign of a struggle, no note, nothing. It's like he just vanished. Jess is losing it, convinced she's next. She's been staying with her parents, but the nightmares follow her wherever she goes. She called me last night, hysterical, saying she saw Mike standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes glowing red, his mouth twisted into a gruesome smile. She's terrified to sleep, convinced he'll come back for her. Tom is still missing. His parents filed a missing person report, but the police haven't found any leads. It's like he disappeared off the face of the earth. Part of me wonders if the demon took him, consumed him whole. I can't shake the feeling that we're all being hunted, picked off one by one. I've been trying to keep it together, but it's getting harder. The hunger is becoming unbearable. It's not just a physical craving anymore. It's something deeper, more primal. I dream of tearing into flesh, of tasting blood. I woke up last night with my mouth smeared with something sticky and sweet. I don't remember what happened, but I found a dead bird on my windowsill, its body mangled and bloody. I can't shake the feeling that I did it, that the demon is making me do things while I sleep. Desperate, I reached out to an online forum for people who've had experiences with the supernatural. I didn't expect much, but a user named DemonHunter42 responded almost immediately. They claimed to have dealt with something similar and offered to help. We arranged a video call, and I'll admit, I was skeptical. But when I saw their face, the scars crisscrossing their skin, I knew they were the real deal. They told me I needed to perform a cleansing ritual, something to sever the demon's connection to me. They walked me through the steps, gathering specific herbs, drawing a protective circle, chanting in Latin. It sounded like something out of a movie, but I was willing to try anything. Last night, I gathered everything I needed and set up in my living room. I drew the circle, lit the herbs, and started chanting. At first, nothing happened. Then, the temperature dropped, and the shadows in the room seemed to thicken, coalescing into a dark mass in the center of the circle. I kept chanting, my voice shaking, the words feeling foreign and strange in my mouth. The shadows shifted, forming into the shape of the demon. Its eyes glowed red, and it smiled at me, a grotesque, mocking smile. "You cannot escape me," it hissed. "You are mine." I forced myself to keep going, my voice rising in desperation. The demon lunged at me, but it was stopped by the circle, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. I kept chanting, tears streaming down my face, my body trembling with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the demon was gone. The room warmed up, the shadows receding. I collapsed, exhausted but relieved. I thought maybe, just maybe, I had done it. But when I woke up this morning, the bite mark was worse. The decay had spread even further, my flesh rotting away faster than before. The hunger was still there, gnawing at me, and the whispers were louder, more insistent. I don't know if the ritual failed or if it just pissed the demon off, but things are worse than ever. I don't know what to do. I'm terrified to sleep, terrified of what I might do next. The decay is spreading faster now, and I can feel the demon's presence stronger than ever. It's like it's inside me, clawing at my insides, trying to take over. If anyone out there has any advice, any idea how to stop this, please, I'm begging you, help me. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. I'm scared I'm going to lose myself completely, that I'll become something monstrous, something evil. I'm back, and things have gotten even worse. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Every day is a nightmare, and I'm running out of hope. The decay has spread to my legs now. The skin is sloughing off in thick, yellowish chunks, leaving behind raw, bleeding flesh. Walking is excruciating. Every step feels like knives stabbing into my bones. I've started using crutches just to get around. The hunger is insatiable. I can't eat normal food anymore. It tastes like ash in my mouth, and no matter how much I force down, it doesn't satisfy the gnawing void inside me. I've caught myself eyeing roadkill, dead animals, anything with flesh. It's like I'm becoming something else, something not human. The cravings are so strong. I'm scared I'll give in. Sarah's gone. She called me a few days ago, hysterical. She said she couldn't take it anymore, that the voices were telling her to hurt herself, to end it all. I tried to calm her down, to tell her to come to my place, but she hung up. I drove to her house as fast as I could, but it was too late. She'd slashed her wrists in the bathtub. There was so much blood. I'll never forget the sight of her lifeless body, the water stained red, her eyes wide open in terror. Jess has been committed to a psychiatric hospital. Her parents found her trying to claw out her own eyes, screaming about the shadows, the eyes watching her. They didn't know what else to do. I visited her once, but she didn't recognize me. She just kept muttering to herself, rocking back and forth. It broke my heart. Mike's body was found in a ditch on the outskirts of town. They said it was an animal attack, but I know better. His flesh was torn apart, deep gouges that looked like they were made by something with claws. His face was frozen in a mask of terror. I can't stop thinking about what he must have gone through in his last moments. I've been trying to contact Demon Hunter 42 again, but they've disappeared. Their account is gone, like they never existed. I feel so alone, so helpless. The whispers are louder now, constant, a never-ending drone in my head. They tell me to do things, horrible things. Sometimes I catch myself listening, considering them. The demon's influence is growing, and I don't know how much longer I can resist. 2 nights ago, I woke up outside, in the woods behind my house. I don't remember how I got there. My clothes were torn, and my hands were covered in blood. I found a dead deer nearby, its body mutilated. The worst part? I don't know if it was me who did it. The hunger, the craving for flesh, it's overpowering. I'm terrified I'm losing control, that the demon is taking over completely. The decay has spread to my torso, my organs feeling like they're rotting inside me. The pain is constant, a burning agony that never lets up. I'm wasting away, my body breaking down piece by piece. I've lost so much weight, I'm just skin and bones now, a walking corpse. I've been doing more research, trying to find something, anything that might help. I found a forum post from a guy who claimed to have dealt with a similar situation. He talked about a ritual, something ancient and dangerous. It involves using your own blood to draw a series of symbols, chanting specific words, and burning a piece of the demon's essence, in this case, the Ouija board. It sounds insane, but I'm out of options. I've gathered everything I need, candles, herbs, a knife. I have the board ready. Tonight I'm going to try it. I don't know if it'll work, or if it'll just make things worse, but I have to try. I can't keep living like this. if you can even call this living. If you're reading this, please wish me luck. And if I don't make it, remember my story. Don't mess with things you don't understand. Don't play with Ouija boards. The consequences are more than you can imagine. I'm about to start the ritual now. I'll update if I survive. If I don't, then this will be my last entry. If you're reading this, then I survived. But I'm not sure how much longer that will last. The ritual was intense, to say the least. I'll try to recount everything as clearly as I can, but some parts are still a blur. I set up in the basement, figuring it was the most secluded place in the house. I drew the symbols in my own blood, the knife slicing into my skin easier than I expected. The symbols glowed a faint red, pulsating with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I lit the candles and herbs, the air filling with a thick, acrid smoke that stung my eyes and throat. With the Ouija board in front of me, I started chanting the words from the forum post. The language felt unnatural on my tongue, each syllable heavy and sharp. The temperature in the room dropped, my breath visible in the dim candlelight. Shadows gathered around me, coalescing into the shape of the demon, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. The demon laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "You think you can banish me?" it hissed. "You are already mine." I kept chanting, my voice growing louder, more desperate. The symbols on the floor flared brighter, and the demon recoiled, its form flickering. I grabbed the Ouija board and held it over the candles, the wood catching fire. The flames roared to life, consuming the board, the smell of burning wood mixing with the acrid smoke. The demon screamed, a sound so piercing it felt like my ears would burst. Its body twisted and writhed, trying to escape the circle. I kept chanting, my voice raw and broken, blood dripping from my wounds. The flames climbed higher, engulfing the board completely, and the demon's form began to dissolve, black smoke rising from its body. For a moment I thought I'd done it. The demon was fading, its screams growing fainter, but then the shadows around me surged, slamming into me with a force that knocked me off my feet. The room went dark, the candles snuffed out, and I felt a cold, crushing weight on my chest. The demon's face loomed over me, its eyes burning into mine. "You cannot escape me," it whispered, its voice a raspy, malevolent hiss. "You will suffer." The pressure on my chest intensified, and I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to die, but then the symbols on the floor flared one last time, a brilliant red light that filled the room. The demon screamed again, a high, keening wail, and then it was gone. The weight lifted, and I could breathe again. I lay there for a long time, gasping for air, my body trembling. The symbols on the floor faded, the candles flickered back to life, and the room warmed up. I forced myself to my feet, every muscle screaming in protest. The Ouija board was nothing but ashes, the smoke lingering in the air. The decay hasn't stopped. If anything, it's gotten worse. My body is falling apart, my skin peeling away in thick, blackened strips. The hunger is still there, gnawing at me, but I'm too weak to do anything about it. I don't know how much longer I have. Maybe the demon is gone, but it left its mark on me, and I can feel myself fading. I've isolated myself completely now. I can't risk hurting anyone else. The voices are quieter, but they're still there, whispering in the back of my mind. I'm scared to sleep, scared of what I might do, but I'm so tired, so weak. If you're reading this, let my story be a warning. Don't mess with things you don't understand. The supernatural is real, and it's not something to be taken lightly. I played with a Ouija board, and it cost me everything. My friends are gone, my body is decaying, and my mind is unraveling. I don't know what will happen to me, but I hope this is the end. I can't take much more. If there's a way to stop this, I haven't found it, but maybe someone else will. Maybe someone will learn from my mistakes. This is it, my final entry. I'm out of time, out of hope. If you're out there, be careful. Don't let curiosity lead you down the same dark path I've taken. The consequences are more than you can imagine. Goodbye.